Hello, and thank you for joining us today on the Dairy Signal. I'm excited to dive into a topic that is pretty new here on the Dairy Signal this afternoon. And we're going to be talking about lost earnings, injured farmers, and those situations you don't necessarily want to find yourself in, but you just may. And it's one of those pieces of information that it's better to know ahead of time and be prepared for in case of a situation that may arise. But before we dive into that discussion today with our speaker, I do want to remind folks, if you're watching live and able to enjoy the Dairy Signal with us here during the exact time of noon, we have the opportunity for you to ask questions if it works out for you. All you have to do is on your video screen, the bottom right corner of your screen has three little dots. You click that, and right there it says ask a question. You can fill out any and all of the information as you so choose. It does ask for an email or a name. If you don't feel comfortable putting that, you can put NA, you can put blank, whatever. We don't discriminate over here. We just would love if you have a question to chime on in and join us here this afternoon, especially as we are joined by Patrick Coffey, who's a shareholder, an attorney at Men Law Firm. So Patrick, we're excited to have you on here this afternoon as we dive into this topic. But before we do so, would you mind giving us a little bit of an introduction about yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you, Amber, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to your folks today. My name is Pat Coffey. I've been an attorney since 1994, representing injured people for all 32 years. I'm at the Men Law Firm. We are, I think we have about 30 lawyers here in Appleton, Wisconsin. Got to know some lawyers that you folks may know pretty well, George Tuig and Tim Halbach and Troy Schneider and Kim Riedbrock years ago, and they've joined our firm a couple of years ago. So we are fortunate to have them on board. I have been working with George and his colleagues for 30 years on dairy-related cases, not just personal injury cases. All I do is litigation, meaning fighting in the court. So if you got a real estate transaction or you've got a business transaction, you go to George or Tim or Troy or Kim. But if you've got kind of a fight on your hands, you come to me, and that would include then motor vehicle accident cases. So been doing that for 32 years, and just happy to be here and talk to you folks at Dairy Signal.
Well, thank you again. And it sounds like this is definitely your bread and butter. So I'm excited to dive into this area with you here this afternoon. I also have to say, you've got some great colleagues there. I mean, from personal opinion, Men Law Firm is a fantastic partner here with professional dairy producers. So we're excited to have you on here just in that capacity, through partnership through the organization, but also knowing that we got a lot to cover here. And let's start out with, the ground setting, the or level playing field, if you will. Let's talk about what exactly it is a damages claim. What makes it a damages claim, just to make sure we're all on the same playing field.
Sure, absolutely. So maybe to back up just a little bit, damages claim results from the fault of someone else. So if we back up just a half a step, what would happen to some of your viewers is they may be driving to a business meeting. They may be driving to another farm field. They may be driving anywhere. And so it could be the result of a motor vehicle accident. It could be someone blows a stop sign, someone hits them from behind, whatever the case may be. So the discussion today is based upon damages that are not, generally speaking, the fault of your listeners. It's typically the fault of someone else. It could be a slip and fall. It could be going into a co-op or going into another business environment, and they have a condition there that they have not properly taken care of. And again, your viewers may have an injury that results from that. It could be a product liability case. I come from a family of farmers in Iowa, and learned at a very early age, about 5 or 6 years old, when I was out there in the farm with my cousins, to stay away from the PTO. And so, someone could get injured in a PTO or in some sort of product that is defective. And so, what you're looking at are situations that something occurs that causes injury to one of your viewers. And it's not that the viewer might not have been, partially at fault for not seeing something or not doing something, but the primary person or entity at fault is someone other than one of your viewers.
Mhm.
So when we get to that point, what we have to do is we would have to show that if something happened to one of your viewers as a result of the negligence of someone else, we have to prove that damages were caused as a result of that accident, as a result of that car accident, that slip and fall, that product manufactured defect. And there's a couple of steps there that I think your viewers need to know about before we kind of jump into damages. One is that we have to be able to prove that the damages we're talking about were caused in the accident. So let me give you an example. I've got a client now who is a farmer. He was involved in an accident, fault of someone else. And he has some injuries to himself, shoulder and back injuries, and neck injuries. But as all farmers know, they work a very hard job that is very physically demanding. And maybe they had a back problem, a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. What we're talking about is that the accident is the cause of the injury. And that doesn't mean that you have to have a perfect back or a perfect shoulder or perfect, physical body, because none of us do, certainly at my age. But what you have to have is that the accident at a minimum aggravated a pre-existing condition. So you had a bad back and it's a heck of a lot worse now. Okay. You had a shoulder surgery 5 years ago. You were doing pretty good for 5 years being a farmer. And all of a sudden you can't move that right arm or you can't move that left arm because the shoulder is all locked up. So you can have either an accident that causes an injury or you have an accident that aggravates an injury. So then when you get past those things, that being who's at fault and then what injury or was an injury caused, then we get into the types of injuries. And you've got a couple of different things to think about there. The way that lawyers talk about it is they talk about general damages and special damages. General damages are basically pain and suffering, limitations on life, limitations on relationship with others, those types of things. What I was asked to talk about today are more special damages. Special damages are things that you can kind of assign a number to. So backing up to those general damages, the judge tells the jury, if you're ever in front of a jury, that it's really the jury's determination as to what they think pain and suffering is worth. There are no formulas. There are no books that anybody can go to. But for special damages, you look at a medical bill, you look at that ambulance bill, and it's $472.18. You look at that hospital bill, you look at future healthcare costs. You got to have that surgery down the road. That's a special damage. The other special damages that we're really here to talk about today is either a wage loss or a loss of earning capacity claim. And that would be basically the impact that your viewer's business would have because they are not able to do what they normally would be able to do. So, when we look at those things, that's kind of what we're here to talk about today. And I can break that down a little more for you if you'd like me to.
Most definitely. I do have to say, before going into that discussion, one of the things that, I mean, you saying you're from Iowa, you have that farm background, you've worked with farmers before. I feel like you know that mentality that a lot of them have of, I'm going to keep working regardless. And I feel like that's an important question or important statement to bring up at the front of this because there's so many people, they're like, it's an injury. It is what it is. I have to get my job done. I have to do X, Y, or Z. I know that can be probably in the general, but in terms of wages and loss there, for some folks, unless it is, I physically cannot get up out of my bed, I cannot get out of my chair, whatever the case is, they're going to do whatever they can to keep working. So how does that sort of mentality, that farmer mentality, play into something like this before we really dive into a lot of the numbers, more of that specifics, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So a couple things. One is a lot of farmers, and again, I represent another farmer who's going through what you're talking about, but a lot of farmers, first of all, think to themselves, oh, geez, I don't want to bring a claim. I'm not that type of person. Um, and quite honestly, that's why myself and George and Tim and Troy and Kim, we like working with farmers because they're not complainers, they're not moaners and groaners, they're not whiners. However, whenever I talk to someone about that, and I've got a different client I'm thinking of right now, their initial reaction was, boy, we don't want to bring a claim against the at fault party. And in Wisconsin, there's two things you got to think about. One is the at fault party most likely has an insurance company. So what you're doing is you're saying, well, gee, I don't want American Family to have to pay. I don't want State Farm to have to pay. And the answer is that's what these insurance companies are there for. People buy insurance because we all make mistakes. I've driven through stop signs. Every one of us has made a mistake at some point on the road. So for farmers who want to be kind of stoic and say, boy, I don't want to do that, the answer really should be, well, I don't want to do that to that individual. And in Wisconsin, you go to the insurance company first. And I think that's important because every time I've had that conversation with farmers and they kind of say, oh yeah, no, I don't care about American Family and their bottom line. I care about the guy who, blew the stop sign. He just made a mistake. And that's a very reasonable, normal thing to think about. Now, to your point, farmers are, again, stoic and not complainers. That cuts both ways. And here's how, in my opinion, the best way to handle it is. Ultimately, most cases settle. Ultimately, you don't go in front of a jury, but you've always got to prepare as though you go in front of a jury. And a juror, generally speaking, does not like a complainer. Okay, so I think farmers in general, if they're nice people, they're straightforward people, they're direct people, they don't play games, they answer questions fairly. When they're not going to complain and they're not going to talk about, as much about how much they hurt, or they're not going to, let it derail their life. That's a positive. Now, what typically I look for then is if I have a client who's a farmer, I'm going to be asking his wife or his kids or his friends or his colleagues, or his partners in his LLC. How is it that, Bob has been impacted by this? So that part is okay. Here's where I think a farmer gets into trouble is not that they want to complain, but that they don't go get the treatment or the follow-up that they should. And that is a problem under the law. That is, there's a requirement to do what's called mitigate your damages. And so you have an obligation that if you think you've got a good doctor, to follow up with that doctor's advice. If the doctor says to go to physical therapy, you go to physical therapy. One of the things insurance companies love are large gaps in medical treatment where nothing happens, because then they get to say back to that causation thing, oh, well, you may have hurt your back in this accident, but you didn't go get treatment for 9 months, and now you're back getting treatment. That's because of your job. That's because of something you were doing on the farm. That's not because of our car accident. So what a farmer needs to do, absolutely, is if the doctor says go get treatment, you go get treatment. If the doctor says do home exercises, do the home exercises. If they're not working, go back to the doctor and tell them that. If they're working, keep doing them. I still say about once every 6 months, follow up with the doctor to ask, is there anything else I could be doing? Is there any other doctor I could go see that may be able to help me with this? Okay. Because if you don't do anything, you're a tough guy. You're just going to kind of grin and bear it. You put up with it. You go out to the field, or you go milk the cows, or go repair the combine, or you do whatever it is that you need to do. You're playing into the insurance company's hand, because they're going to say, well, you did all these things and you must not be hurt from the car accident. Anything you claim now must be because you're milking the cows, or you're repairing the equipment, or you're doing whatever. Because what the insurance companies try to do is to blame it on anybody other than themselves. So that's a really good point. A client of mine is farmer doing exactly that, and I talked to him one day, and he said, well, what I've noticed is that when I look up and look to the right, I pass out. And I said, well, when did that happen? Well, I was on top of a bale of hay. How big was the bale of hay? It was a roll. It was probably about 15 feet. I said, good Lord, you literally could kill yourself. Get in to see a doctor. And he did. And, they're helping him with that kind of stuff. So being a tough guy does not mean you can whine and complain and moan and groan. What it means is you get the job done, but you have to follow up with your doctors, and you have to follow up with the advice that they give you.
So I think that's really good information right there, especially going into this conversation. And I'm just gonna kind of reiterate what I heard here was it's okay to make a claim because like you said, insurance is there for a reason. It's not going to, in theory, ruin somebody's life. I think that's always the biggest worry, and I appreciate you hitting that off the bat right away here. And then second, go to the doctor. I know none of us like it, especially I feel like in rural and agriculture, it's almost like I haven't gone to the doctor in 15 years. It's almost like a brag. But in this case, help yourself in the long run, especially with something like this. So going and moving forward from this question, Pat, and moving into more of the discussion specifically on like wages, that that special there, that word, the special portion that we were talking about earlier, or plan to get more into here, is say you decide to meet with a lawyer, you do have something for claims, and you are in the situation that you know that it has impacted your earnings, has impacted your ability to do your job. Maybe you had to hire an extra hand because you couldn't do your job anymore on the farm for whatever that looks like. Where do you start? Because it starts to feel like, oh my gosh, this gets really overwhelming.
Yep.
How do you advise people to start documenting correctly, or what they might need as they go about this process?
Yep, absolutely. And let me back up just 1 second. There's one part of it that I think is real important for the community here that we're talking to, farmers. In a car accident case, or in a product liability case, or a slip and fall, you may have psychological issues as a result of it. I mean, you may have PTSD because the impact itself was so significant, and client of mine told me who had PTSD from a car accident, I thought it only came from, wartime and military. No, PTSD is a real legitimate condition that if you're feeling, that you have an issue, you must go talk to a doctor and set aside the accident case. It's what you need to do to get proper health care and to get yourself back on your feet. The second part of it can be people certainly over time can get depressed, anxiety, some melancholy, because they can't do what they used to do. They have that shoulder surgery, and I can no longer, throw a nail on a board because it's my right hand, or they, broke their leg and involved their knee, and they can't walk as much as they used to be able to do. And that certainly impacts them. That's another situation where you need to go talk to your family doctor at a minimum to make sure that you're getting treatment for it. And then, of course, obviously that dovetails into it's part of the claim with regard to the accident. So sometimes farmers think, I'm a tough guy and I can kind of handle things and I don't need help from anybody else. That's not the case, and that should be avoided. That should be something that should be really something that you don't follow up with. So, Amber, though, to your question on the special damages, so kind of the dollars and cents of things. When I meet with a client and we talk about their injuries, and they say it's taken me away from the farm, or it's taken me away from my chores, There are a number of ways that farmers need to document that. So first, let me start with the documentation that you have beforehand, before the accident ever occurs. So the documentation that you should have, and I think that a number of farms have this, is good. You know, if they've got employees, they've got good wage information on employees. They have good information with regard to what their son or their daughter or their wife are doing and what their obligations are in terms of, you know, the one dairy farmer who the wife took care of the calves and the boys and dad took care of the cows. So you have a good understanding historically about what it is that you did. The other thing is you hopefully have, and you very likely do have, a good understanding of, you know, kind of what your revenue is, what your expenses are, you know, if you're working with a consultant, what your profit margins are. You've got obviously an understanding of what your debt circumstances are, and your projections for into the future. That's all going to be important. All that documentation is going to be important. That is documentation that exists before the accident happens. Cow count, dairy comp, you know, all that kind of stuff is very, very important. And you want to be backing that up on computers and make sure that you have it well documented and preserved. Now the accident happens. Okay, well, then I've got a client here who says, well, I can't do what I used to do. I would run this, I'd be in charge of the workers. I would be the one that was responsible for the dairy production versus the one that's responsible for, you know, the crops or the feed or, you know, that type of thing. Okay, well, now what you can do is you can take that documentation that you had before, and let's say that it's, you know, you were in charge of the crops and you were out there planting, combining, you were running the workers, you know, you were out there with them doing those things. Well, not somebody else has got to do it. So typically what farmers will do is that they'll take their son or their daughter or their wife or whomever, and they'll just switch it over and say, well, you know, they can pick that up. Well, that only goes so far. So to your point, you know, one way that you document kind of the loss is that you look at a hired person replacement workers. And if you have, and that goes back to having that good documentation before the accident, you know, we had 15 workers here on the farm, and we had to hire this extra one because I had to have somebody do the combining, right? Somebody do the planting, right? It's the spraying or whatever it may be. So that's a good, easy way to identify, and make no mistake about it. When you have a claim for injuries, paperwork is what's required, particularly for these special damages. You know, again, general damages are kind of the pain and suffering and the impact in your life. The special damages are the numbers, the money. And you need to have paperwork. So you hire that replacement worker, you've got that paperwork. That's a pretty straightforward one. But sometimes it doesn't work that way because you can't hire somebody, or they don't show, or you're doing things that are more complicated than just hiring a temporary worker. You're, you know, monitoring the markets and determining when you're going to buy and sell, if you're a cash cropper, or you're going to, you know, run, you know, your let's say, God forbid, your injury is significant and you can't continue to communicate with the banker who wants to know exactly what's going on and where's the money coming from. Well, there's a couple of other ways that you would be looking at what the potential damages are. And those other ways are experts. They're called vocational experts. And vocational experts can come in and they can say, look, in reality, what you're doing, if you're a dairy farmer of a larger operation, or even maybe not so large, you're the head of a business. And you're running a $500,000 business, $1 million, a $20 million. And this goes back to looking at those past records. So you've got accounting records, you've got income or tax returns, you've got income statements, you've got balance sheets, You've got all sorts of stuff. Obviously you have an accountant that's helping you with things. And then all of a sudden, well, the CEO, and that's what some of these folks are, is out. And vocational experts, and you can't just snap your fingers and replace, grandma or grandpa who's literally running the place. You gotta figure out, how do I value the services that the injured person was originally giving to the farm? And another way to do that is to get a vocational expert. And a vocational expert can say, look, this is what happens. And you would be amazed at, certainly we all have no problem realizing the government spends money. They spend money on every study you can think of when it comes to vocational analysis. And that vocation means your job itself. And they'll be able to tell you what a CEO of a certain size company in a certain region is making or should be making. They'll break it down into different types of positions, and certainly these government documents from the Department of Labor and other studies that are done by places like University of Wisconsin-Madison break it down into the ag business versus others. So that may be a second way. So the first way you look at documenting this wage loss is a replacement worker. The second way you do it is through a vocational analysis. The third thing that you can do, and it gets more complicated. Particularly, this may be more effective if you got a smaller operation. Let's say that, the farmer is the one who's doing everything. He's planting, he's harvesting, he's preparing the TMR, he's feeding, he's got two 15-year-old and a 17-year-old out there that's helping him. He's milking 50 or 100 cows. He's doing what he can to produce the money on his own. Maybe he's got the plans to expand, but not quite there. Well, then what you're going to be doing, because again, these insurance companies will look at anything they can to say that really that's not your true worth. So let's say, God forbid, a person like this running a 100 cow or 200 cow dairy gets into a car accident and can't go back to work for a year. Multiple surgeries, recovery therapies, that type of thing. Well, then you get into really an agricultural economist. A lot of times you could use your accountant, but you start to compare and contrast. Let's just say the accident occurs in February of 2026. Well, okay, let's look at what 2025 looked like in 24 and 23 and 22, and give an idea and get a projection as to kind of where we were going, what we were doing, and what happened. And then, you've got the main cog in the wheel who is out for 10 months starting in February of 2026, you're going to see 26 look real bad. So there, you could do that kind of comparison analysis. Sometimes it gets more complicated the bigger you get, the more different things that could occur. You, God forbid, have Eonis break out, or you have something going on in your herd that obviously has nothing to do with the accident. The insurance company is going to bite on that. And if the dollar amounts are big enough that you're claiming, they're going to say, no, that's not us. That's really what's going on over here. So there are ways to try to quantify, and again, for those special damages we're talking about, try to assign a dollar value to it. And those are some of the ways. Other ways for larger operations is if you have something where the head of the dairy farm is the managing member of the LLC is running the LLC, and it's dad, and he's getting paid X amount of dollars as a salary, as well as distributions at the end of the year. You can look at what was it that what did he make in 24, 23, 22, and if you have to save some money. Dad all of a sudden is cutting his salary in half, and then that becomes, people think salaries. Well, it's not really wage loss. Well, there's another thing in the law called loss of earning capacity. So if you're a worker at a dairy farm, and you don't own it, but you get into a car accident and you're making whatever $20 an hour, $15 an hour, that's fairly straightforward wage loss claim. Because I was making 15, $20 an hour, $25 an hour, whatever it is, beforehand, and now I'm making zero, and here's my wage loss, and send it off to the bookkeeper at the dairy, and they can do the analysis. But if you're the one that's all of a sudden out, and there really is nothing assigned to it, but you have a salary that is paid by the LLC to you. That's how you have it set up, with distributions at the end of the year, obviously after the milk check comes in and the bank is paid, that type of thing. Then that's called a loss of earning capacity. So you could say, look, I was making, whatever. I was drawing $50,000 a year, and I can only draw $25,000 a year, and I was getting bonuses of whatever it may be, depending upon the size of dairy. And I didn't take those bonuses because I knew that they needed to hire 2 or 3 or 4 people to help out, or we needed someone from our accountant to help us out, or we needed to hire a ag consultant to help us out, because I'm the one that does all that stuff and I can't do anything because I have a head trauma or something like that. Then you're looking at what's called loss of earning capacity. And you say, okay, well, the farmer has a loss of earning capacity, and how do we determine that? Well, we get an expert again, but we look back at what did they make before? What were they doing before? What can they do now? And they're not making what they used to make. So, number of ways to look at it.
So, Pat, it really sounds like, though, that good documentation is really the king of it all, though. If you've got good documentation prior to an accident, that's really going to help you out long term when going through a situation like this. One of my questions, though, I think, because we were talking about, gosh, what was it? The loss of income, and you're able to see year to year differences, like saying 26 is going to be less of a year because of, an injury or an accident that occurred. How long do these cases typically occur, or how long do you have to wait to be able to prove, for example, loss of income or loss of wages over a certain amount of time? Because that can definitely really impact, what people are thinking, oh gosh, this is going to be a couple months versus this is going to be a couple years.
Yep, absolutely. So first of all, I would go a step further with documentation. If you don't have it, you probably don't have a claim. That's how important it is. So get your documentation in line. And by that, I mean your business documentation, not only, how many head you have and what their production is, but how many employees you have, what they're doing, why they're doing it, how much they're getting paid. That is vital, because if you don't have that, you've got to be able to have documentation to do a comparison of basically before the accident and after the accident. And then, the things we've talked about so far depend upon what type of circumstance you have, but there are ways to compare kind of before and after. But if you don't have the documentation before, it's not going to work. The insurance company is not just going to believe you to say, well, this is what I was doing before. That doesn't work that way. And the second point, you bring up a really good point. The answer to your question is how long can this take? A long, long time. Okay. In Wisconsin, as a general rule of thumb, you have 3 years from the date of the accident until you have to file a lawsuit. I typically advise people do not file a lawsuit until you're at a point where where you reach what's called maximum medical improvement. And so that'll dovetail into a conversation about future vocational loss that I can bring up, we can talk about in a minute, but maximum medical improvement. Well, that takes about a year to get to. Doctors don't like to really say how's, Bob or Jim going to be for about a year. So you start off with the concept of, you're generally speaking talking about a year from the day of the accident until you can even start thinking about potentially getting reimbursed for the wage loss or the vocational loss of, your inability to work. it's never a year. It's never the 366th day. So you're really talking about a couple of years. And then if you have to file a lawsuit, I mean, if there's a large dairy that's run by, kind of the dad, and the boys are talking about how to buy in, the dad has built the thing up and, so on. And that person gets hurt badly, and there's a way to collect on insurance. The insurance company, if the dollars are big enough, they'll fight you for 2 or 3 years. I mean, they will fight and they will. So you take that 1 to 2 years and you add another 2 or 3. I mean, you could be looking at 4 or 5 years before you get compensation for that either wage loss or that vocational loss. And I've had that happen, and it's hard on farms because you're all operating and at tough margins, and you're trying to figure out how to make any money and keep the bank off your back and keep the government off your back and so on. And then all of a sudden you got to figure out how in the heck do I lose this myself as a source of income or a part of a source of income, and then I got to absorb that for 3, 4, 5 years. That definitely happens. Now, how do you, that begs the question, how do you avoid getting into that hole? Well, not that I am a big advocate for, I'm certainly not an insurance agent, but I do believe, and I had a client who was a very large dairy client get into a very bad accident, head-on collision, 2-lane highway, middle of the day, flat. The other guy was strung out on, meth. And the problem was, and this is something I would strongly recommend this first component to your viewers. His auto insurance agent did not appreciate the value of what he brought to the farm. I mean, the bank was, you know how it operates. I mean, of course, they're loaning to the entity, but when the guy's not sitting there, that's been sitting there for 40 years, they get more nervous. Okay. And that insurance agent didn't appreciate the value of what that farmer brought to the overall operation. And, a guy on methamphetamine has no money and he crosses the center line. He has no insurance on that car. Not supposed to be driving without insurance, but lots of people do. And this client of mine had, I think he had $700,000 or $800,000 in medical bills for all the surgeries he needed. But his insurance agent only had what's called, the other guy was uninsured, no insurance. There's a thing called uninsured, and my client had $300,000 of uninsured coverage. What he should have had, his agent should have had $4 million of uninsured coverage. So go to your insurance agent, talk to them about how can I be protected if somebody crosses the center line and hits me. And then you find out what the premium is and you do the cost benefit analysis. In this case, great guy, had never even heard of that. And some insurance agents should have been saying, wait a minute, you're running, I think he was running 4,000 acres. You've got a 2,500 cow dairy here. You've got a 10,000 cow dairy out in Nebraska. Somebody should have figured out that person needed more insurance coverage, because to your point, Amber, you can go years and not have that. Now he was fortunate enough that he had things set up otherwise what he had, and what I would also recommend is you folks look into a disability policy. So if someone is injured who's running a dairy facility, whether it's 50 cows or 5,000 cows, I don't care. If I'm out, if I can't work, how do I get money in the door in that 2, 3, 4, 5 year time frame that an insurance company will, use that as leverage against you? And they will. There's no doubt about it. Well, it'd be nice to have a disability policy there that you make a claim to the disability policy. It helps replace the income that you otherwise would have had. You can put it back into the business. You can help pay the mortgage on the house, take care of the kids, pay the bank loan, whatever it may need. And again, what you do is you go talk to a disability policy insurance agent and you find out how much it'll cost and you do a cost benefit analysis. But Amber, you're right. These insurance companies they can drag it out, and sometimes they intentionally do because they know somebody's kind of on the ropes and they need the cash. And it's not fair, but that's the way life is.
Yeah, I mean, when folks are already in a situation like this, it's never ideal. Nobody ever wants to be in a situation, but between the disability policy, knowing what their uninsured coverage is, like that stuff right there that you don't think about until you have to, or you're in that situation. So having these conversations earlier oftentimes can potentially help those down the line with, whatever the worst case may be. One of the other questions I have for you, and I mean, it helps that you set the stage in terms that this doesn't just happen. These lawsuits, they don't just snap your fingers and are done. And especially with the understanding that it's probably going to be a year before you can truly do anything. So how does, some of the seasonality of what we do as farmers play into this? For example, I'm thinking of somebody who on the day to day can do quote unquote majority of their job, but maybe when it comes to planting or harvest, they can't get in that tractor. It's too rough on their back, their neck, whatever the case may be. They just can't function in that piece of equipment like they once did. How does seasonality play into it when it's not all of the year, but this chunk of the year, which is a critical chunk, might not be what it once was?
Yep, yep, and that certainly happens. So you get someone who's injured, and yeah, they can sit in front of the computer, or they can run the HR, or they can talk to the bank, or look at the finances, or figure. But when it comes to you're going to go out there in September or October, you're going to you're going to help the guys working in the field to bring in the crops for the feed, or you're scraping down the stalls, or you're doing whatever needs to be done because you've got more cows than you've had before. You're in the middle of an expansion, something like that. That's where the more physically demanding jobs is where you try to hire that replacement labor. And that really is probably the easiest, most straightforward evidence of what would otherwise be a vocational loss. Now, what it's doing is minimizing your value because it's just you're assigning a number to it that's a replacement cost. But it's a very easy way to say, look, we were in the middle of an expansion. 2 days after this accident, we got delivered another 1,000 cows to fill up, what we got. I was going to be the one scraping the stalls, or whatever. It's October, and I was going to be out there, and we had to hire 4 different people to make up for what it is that I can do because I work 20 hours a day, and it's hard for an insurance company to argue against that. The harder situations are is when you've got somebody who runs the dairy farm and they have a head injury, and all of a sudden they don't have a memory for numbers and details and that type of thing. And then you're talking about that disability policy, but you're also talking about having to hire either whether it's a son, daughter, whomever, to run the dairy facility itself, and that becomes problematic. But when you get into the seasonal stuff, and if it's seasonal and it's more of the physical labor, the physically demanding stuff, you get out there to try to hire that replacement labor, and then you keep real good documentation because you want to be able to show I never had the need for those extra 4 guys, and now I do, and here's why. And you can show the before and the after picture. And the insurance company just really doesn't have much to argue with that. There was another thing, Amber, that I had mentioned earlier about a vocational loss. Since I brought up, a head injury, there is a claim also for it's not just wage loss. It's not just past stuff. If you're that year and a half, 2 years out, it may be that the doctor, and this is where you need a doctor to say, you're not going to do X. Okay. You have a an auto accident case, and you have 3 discs that need to be replaced, and you're the guy out there doing the planting and the harvesting and the spraying, and the doctor says you're not going to be on a tractor like that with a back like this because the surgery we just did is going to, pop open all the screws and everything we just put in there. So then you can look at a future loss claim. And how do you do that? What you've got to do is get to a lawyer that's done these types of claims before. So, or much like my involvement in the agriculture industry, get to a lawyer like George or Tim or Troy, who they may not do this kind of work, but they know what a dairy operation is like. And then they call someone like me who, develops the relationship and the trust with them. But what happens sometimes is I don't want to leave the impression that you look at what the dairy lost, because really, technically, the argument is that the dairy isn't the one that got injured. It's Bob Smith, it's Tom Johnson, it's the person. And that's where you'd want to, if you have that, back that I ain't never going back out in that field. It's just, unfortunately, I'm not doing that. Or you have that head injury that you're never going to get that memory back and that ability, those executive functioning skills, the cognition, the memory, the follow through, the recall. It's just not going to happen because that idiot blew that stop sign and hit you. What you do is you get a medical doctor to testify about those limitations, and then you make what's called a future vocational claim, and it is really a future loss of earning capacity claim. So everybody has it's not just wage loss. Everybody has an earning capacity, and your earning capacity is what would you have made over time, and what you do is through expert testimony, a vocational expert to your accountant, you're going to want to be able to show, look, I didn't have to hire those 3 extra people out there to do the cropping because of my back. And here's the cost associated with that to the dairy. So that's not your loss there. The loss is, and I would have paid myself X amount of dollars. And here's historically, to your point about paperwork, what I did pay to myself. And I can't do that anymore because the dairy can't afford it. Well, then you give that to a vocational expert. A vocational expert says, okay, Dr. Jones says, the farmer can't do it. The farmer has documentation about what they had for employees. He's hired replacement workers. That is a loss to the dairy. That translates to a loss to the farmer himself of X amount of dollars. Let's say that's $15,000 a year. And the farmer's 40. Well, now you have a work life expectancy, and this is all expert stuff. It's not something the farmer would need to do, but you have all this work life expectancy, and now you've got 25 years, at least 40 to 65 of a loss, and then all of a sudden those numbers get pretty big. Now that goes back to, Amber, what you had said, which is documentation is critical. The original documentation of how you're operating, what you're doing, where the revenue is going, how much you're getting paid, what you're pulling out. And then, as we all know, farmers underpay themselves ridiculously so because they, as I like to say about my cousins back in Iowa, they'd rather cut off their right arm than sell an acre of land. But that goes back to, okay, now what's the value of that to the person? And if, they've got to hire that replacement worker, you get these agricultural economists and you say, no, the farmer's W-2 may show $10,000 a year, but they have these write-offs, they have these things that they utilize, their actual income and the benefits to them should be whatever, 20, 30, 50, 100, $200,000 a year, whatever it may be. And that's where you need to work with a lawyer who knows the right experts to contact to work up those claims if the dollars justify it. Now, every time I say the word expert, that costs a lot of money. So that the numbers better add up to justify it. But there's certainly, I don't want people to think, well, I can only get kind of past stuff. And if I'm moving forward into the future, I'm just kind of out of luck. That's not the case. You have future loss of earning capacity claims, just like you have on those special damages, future healthcare expense claims. But those take experts and a lawyer who's knowledgeable in the area to work those up for you.
So when it comes to getting a claim, getting a lawyer, from the very beginning, when does that start in the process for somebody who's had something happen to them in one of these accidents? You mentioned that you really can't start a claim process until give or take a year in, whatever that may be. But do you recommend that somebody, find that lawyer before so you can start figuring out what you should be doing in the meantime? What do you recommend?
Yeah. So, and I maybe I misspoke on that. When I made the comment about you really don't get to that what's called maximum medical improvement for a year. That's the first time to start thinking about settling the case.
Gotcha.
Yeah. The answer to your question is get a lawyer as soon as possible.
Okay.
Period. End of story. There is what I always tell people are pretty much three things. One is your health comes first, okay, or the health of your husband or your spouse or whomever was in that accident. You take care of them first. You get them set first. That's what's important. Remember, you've got 3 years in Wisconsin from the day of the accident until you have to file a lawsuit. Okay. I'm not recommending to wait 3 years, but that doesn't mean that you've got to, call a lawyer from, the waiting room while someone is in surgery. You can take a step. And any lawyer, by the way, that thinks you need to hire me right now, immediately, be careful. Okay. The answer is you don't. Okay. Second thing I tell people is when you're going to pick a lawyer that is recommended to you by someone who's done this before. Okay. Not every law firm that advertises is bad, but not every law firm that advertises is good. So you want to go to, George, Tim, Troy. You want to go to your accountant. You want to go to your ag consultant. You want to go to somebody who says, hey, I worked with this guy, or I saw this guy, or I saw this gal, and she did a great job on this case. Give them a call. And that lawyer may say, look, all I do is commercial litigation, fighting over like LLCs and stuff, but maybe they've got someone too. So a referral from kind of a trusted source is the second thing that's important. The third thing that I tell people is do not respond to the unsolicited mailings. I cannot tell you how many times I've met with people that say, well, I got all these things in the mail. Okay. Not to say that those law firms that solicit like that are bad. Again, some are good, some are not good. But just doing something because you get a folder in the mail without talking to someone to get some sort of knowledge about who it is that you're picking doesn't make a lot of sense. The other thing then is in that context, meet with the lawyer and meet with the lawyer on your terms. So I have met with obviously clients in my office. I've met with clients before George and Tim and Troy and Kim joined us at their office because that's where they're comfortable. I've met with clients at accountants' offices. I've met with clients at their kitchen table. But what I do is I say, what works best for you? What are you most comfortable with? And then everybody, the one thing about farmers we talked about, they're great people and they're honest and they're straight shooters and they don't whine and complain. They're also good judges of character. And if you get a good feeling from a lawyer, I was talking about it earlier at the end of the meeting. He said, you know what? I like you. You're a straight shooter. You're like me. I'm going to go with you. Then trust your instinct. But if there's something off, there's something that just doesn't make sense, keep asking questions, keep having conversations. And if that feeling doesn't go away, you need to look for another lawyer.
Yeah. I think those are really good things to be thinking about if you are in the situation. Again, nobody ever wants to be in them, but somebody's going to be. So having that information and just the ability to take a step back out of the emotional side of it and have the time and know that, yes, you want to retain a lawyer sooner rather than later, but knowing that it doesn't have to be, like you said, while you're still sitting in the waiting room and trying to figure the first health portion out. One of the other questions I have for you, though, especially from your experience, when thinking about your time working with farmers, what do you wish that they would have, done ahead of time before they filed a claim, before the situation occurred? Is there anything that we can be thinking about preparing now in case the worst case situation comes, but still within a reasonable ask, if you will?
Yep, two things. One is I would highly recommend people go talk to an insurance agent about getting that extra insurance. I think that farmers they don't get paid. There's not a lot of cash in it, but there's a lot of assets. So you folks are worth a lot more than you probably think you're worth, and you've got a lot on the line, and you want to make sure you're properly insured. I would strongly recommend going to your local auto insurance agent and saying, "What about this uninsured stuff? What about this underinsured stuff?" And for that matter, do I have enough insurance if I make that mistake and blow through that stop sign? And God forbid hit that, orthopedic surgeon who's on his way down to the Badger game. Because that they'll look at if you're not properly organized as a business entity, you want to make sure you protect yourself. The second thing is, and this is not typically a strength of farmers, but it needs to be. Again, documentation wins and loses cases. But your documents need to be organized. So get to somebody. I don't care if it's your accountant or your bookkeeper or your wife or yourself or your son or daughter who are good with computers. But make sure that the documents that you have, the documents on the cows and the production and the fat content, I mean, the whole 9 yards, documents on employees, documents on policies and procedures at your LLC, your operating agreement, your lawyer, your accountant, your tax returns, profit and loss statements. Make sure those are all well organized. And if you don't do it, have someone do it, because it's great to say, yeah, oh yeah, we've got all that stuff. And then you ask them for it, and then it comes in, and me as a lawyer, I know what those things are, but I can't make heads or tails. And then the farmer's, he's trying to go to the doctor and follow up with care and, get back out in the field, and he doesn't want to screw around with the lawyer. And isn't this why I hired you and all that kind of stuff? And the answer is, the more organized you can be on the front end, the more that it will benefit you on the back end, if God forbid you're ever in an accident.
I think that is a great place to leave off here today, because we've had a really good discussion here, Pat. I mean, again, nobody wants to be in this situation, but having these conversations ahead of time can help us be more prepared if, the worst case does happen. So I just want to say thank you so much for your time here this afternoon, and really appreciate your discussion here. And even your guys' partnership with our organization, because truly MenLaw is one of those that we think of in truly the fondest of ways. And we really appreciate your guys' time, and your time specifically here this afternoon.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity, and we view you guys the exact same way. So if any of your listeners, anybody who listens to this later on has any questions, don't hesitate to give me a call. Pat Coffey at the MenLaw Firm, and we would be more than willing to help you guys out to the extent that we can.
Well, thank you so much again, Pat. As we wrap up here today, I want to say thank you to those who joined us and listened here today on the Dairy Signal, or catching up maybe at a later date. And I also have to say that we are in the middle of the July, and we have a lot of great programs starting up already here later this month, including Accelerate, which is our program for college-age interns and helping them prepare for what life and employment after college looks like, and getting them prepared for that. And we also have Carbon Crops and Cows on July 28th and 30th for those who are interested in learning more about carbon, what it looks like on their farm, and their greenhouse emission scores. So if you're interested in either one of those or anything else that we have coming up, head over to our website at pdpw.org. But for now, thank you for joining us here today, and we'll see you here next week on the Dairy Signal. Bye now.